This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good evening. My name is Frank Alexander, and I'd like to welcome you to this Silver to Gold Anniversary Conference of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion. This is a special evening for us in so many ways. It is the center of our 2.5-day conference, which is celebrating the work we have done here at the Center over the past 25 years, but asking in every session the question of what are the dominant issues going to be for the next 25 years? How should we, who work in the field of law and in the field of religion, attend to the questions that we have not attended to thus far? How should we anticipate the critical issues that we need to be about? And tonight's session is going to be challenging us on precisely those ways, those issues. I'm delighted to welcome back to Emory Law School President Robert Franklin, graduate of Morehouse, a classmate of mine at Harvard Divinity School, PhD, not me, him, PhD from Chicago, a member of the Candler School of Theology faculty here at Emory, taught at Harvard and a host of other institutions. He was a senior fellow of our Law and Religion Project, one of the many things that he has done for us here at Emory, and most recently became president of Morehouse University. I am so excited for Morehouse and for President Franklin. The format for this evening will follow what we've been doing in our other sessions, which is that Professor Franklin will be introducing the speakers and moderating the session. We will hopefully have time for questions from the audience after we've heard from each of our three major presenters this evening. President Franklin, it's all yours.
Well, thank you a great deal, and welcome to all of you. Welcome back to this important venue of inquiry and discussion. Let me also express enormous appreciation for the dedication of this great university to the Law and Religion program, to the Law and Religion conversation. We've all learned a great deal from the output of this important program based here at Emory Law School. We're all grateful for the leadership of John Whitty, of Frank Alexander, and all who contribute to these important conversations. And I've discovered that there's always an inverse relationship between the amount of time that I talk and the amount that I learn. So I'd like to speak as little as possible this evening and move aside to hear from the very distinguished panel that we've assembled. Let me also thank all of the schools of the Atlanta University Center that shared in the sponsorship and inviting colleagues, students, faculty, and alumni to this occasion tonight. Many of you are here. We're grateful. And it's certainly good for me as a prodigal professor to return to Emory. Public conversation, public anxiety about the well-being of African American families, the well-being of African American children in the post-Moynihan years has been vigorous, often ebbing and flowing. At this time in our cultural life, it does appear to flow with the moral campaign of Bill Cosby and many others who have joined that campaign. Concern now focuses on what the nation will do and what African American communities and institutions will do to strengthen families, and to mobilize the resources of our strongest institutions, especially religious institutions, but also to compel public investment in strengthening all families, and especially African American families. Hence the role of law and of public policy and, of course, the marketplace. And so tonight we're especially pleased to have three of the most thoughtful leaders and activists on this set of issues. We'll hear in the order in which I now introduce them tonight Enola Aird holds a JD from Yale University, and she is the founder and director of the Motherhood Project at the Institute for American Values in New York City. Enola was appointed to the Connecticut Commission on Children and worked for 2 years at the Children's Defense Fund, serving as director of its violence prevention program and acting director of the Black Community Crusade for Children. It was in that capacity I first came to know and began working with Enola. Her articles on the state of motherhood in the United States have been published in the Wall Street Journal, Theology Today, and Parents Magazine, among other publications, and she's contributed numerous chapters to several books. Welcome, Enola. And we'll hear from Stephen L. Carter, who also holds a JD from Yale University. He's the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law at Yale Law School. He came to Yale as an assistant professor in 1982 after clerking for Judge Spotswood Robinson III of the D.C. Circuit of the U.S. Court of Appeals and for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the U.S. Supreme Court. Professor Carter's expertise is in constitutional law, contracts, intellectual property law, secrets and lying, and law and religion. Frank, I wonder if I might suggest that for a future conference topic. Secrets and lying in law and religion. Professor Carter's articles and books on law, religion, and culture are well known to many of you, including the titles God's Name in Vain, The Wrongs and Rights of Religion in Politics, and The Culture of Disbelief, How American Law and Politics Trivialize Religious Devotion. To the envy of many university professors, he's also published 2 best-selling novels, The Emperor of Ocean Park and New England White. As for me, I'm still working on the next great American novel. And then our third panelist, Judge Leah Ward Sears. Judge Sears holds a JD from this distinguished law school, and she's the Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court. When sworn in, Judge Sears became the only African-American female Chief Justice in the United States. Sears is also the first woman and the youngest person to sit on the Supreme Court of Georgia. Sears serves on the board of directors of the Morehouse School of Medicine, its Center for Child Abuse and Neglect, the Board of Visitors of Mercer Law School, the Sadie G. Mays Nursing Home, and the Georgia chapter of the National Council of Christians and Jews. And she's also a board member of the Mission New Hope. She's also a member of Cornell University's Women's Council, the Steering Committee for Georgia's Women's History Month, and the Children's Defense Fund's Black Community Crusade for Children. In 2006, she was selected by Lodrigan as one of 500 leading judges in America. Our format, as Professor Alexander indicated, each of our speakers will present for 20 minutes, at which point I will return to the podium. We'll ask those who wish to pose questions to simply line up at the 2 microphones on the floor near the middle of the room and to pose your question, and we will proceed and conclude promptly at 9 p.m. We look forward to a stimulating and enlightening conversation on law, religion, and the future of the American family. Enola Aird, please welcome our panelists.
Thank you very much, President Franklin, for your kind introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I would like to first begin by congratulating the Center for the Study of Law and Religion and thank the Center for its excellent work over the years in helping us to more clearly understand the complex relationship between religion and law, 2 very powerful forces in any society. I also am very grateful and want to express my thanks for the invitation to help point us in the direction of a path toward a better future for the African American family. I must say that I am humbled to be in the company of scholars. I joined this conversation chiefly as a mother. My scholarly interest in this subject is far outweighed by my personal interest. I am the mother of two absolutely beautiful African-American children, and they are the principal reasons for my passionate concern about the future of the Black family. Now, to put it in context, and I know that we've had a conversation about family earlier today, all families in the United States are facing challenges. But in addition to those challenges that are faced by everyone else, African American families have special concerns, special challenges. The Black family has really been under siege ever since Black people came to this country. We endured 2 centuries of family-crushing enslavement and another of Jim Crow. Even in the years since the Civil Rights Movement, continuing racial and economic discrimination, and until recently, family dividing welfare policies have put Black and white families on vastly unequal footings. It must be said, though, that even against this hostile backdrop, many Black families and many Black children are doing extraordinarily well. But the constant assaults have worn families down. And the results show up clearly in the data. Too many Black families are in crisis. The rates of marriage in the Black community are startlingly low. Other negative indicators startlingly high. So, it will undoubtedly come as something of a surprise to you, therefore, that in my remarks this evening, I will not dwell on the importance of promoting healthy marriages in the Black community, or the need to strengthen the relationships between African American fathers and their children, or the importance of strengthening couples and parents' communication and parenting skills, nor will I focus on the need for increased employment opportunities, economic opportunities, and other social and economic supports for Black people, especially Black men. For the record, though, I believe firmly that we need all of these initiatives and more in order to strengthen the African American family. But I want to focus our attention for the next few minutes on what I believe to be one of the most important things that we have to do, along with a long list of other things we have to do, to pave the way for a renaissance for African American families. Our charge this evening is to be prophetic, and in that spirit, I want to venture to say that the hardest question of law and religion and the African American family that will have to be faced over the next 25 years is this: how to extinguish, for once and for all, the lie of Black inferiority that continues to undermine the ability of Black people to love themselves and to love each other. The lie of Black inferiority says that Black people are not as beautiful, not as smart, not as capable, not as worthy, not as lovable as white people, and for that matter, most other people. That lie was first told centuries ago to justify the colonization, enslavement, and dehumanization of Black people. It has shaped other people's views of us, and most importantly, it has shaped our views of ourselves. It hit at the very heart of the Black family by undercutting our abilities to form healthy relationships, healthy self-images, and to create the healthy, nurturing relationships, marriages, and families that we and our children so desperately need. It is as simple as this: the more you love yourself, the more you can love other people. People who believe at some level that they are not beautiful, not capable, not worthy, not lovable, will find it hard to love other people and build nurturing relationships and families. But if they do, these people, if they love themselves, and if they think that they are worthy, they will believe that they are entitled to the best, and they will be able to build nurturing, healthy relationships and marriages. I believe, President Franklin, you refer to it in your book as the love deficit. Whatever it is that we want to call it, it is close to the core, I believe, of what is ailing us as a community. And it is time, in my view, for Black people to rise up against the weight of history, to love ourselves and each other fully, to make it possible for us to build the stronger and healthier families that we need. This, I believe, should be our foundational covenant. Much has been written about the amazing strengths of Black people who were able, as many of our grandparents used to say, to make a way out of no way. Out of the depths of enslavement and official segregation in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, African Americans embarked on a most extraordinary journey toward freedom, establishing families, building communities, all the while making priceless contributions to America and the world. But there's another side to the story. Alvin Poussin and Amy Alexander, in a book called Lay My Burden Down, remind us that these Olympian accomplishments have been accompanied in many instances by deep pain. As they put it, life has taken a tremendous toll on the minds and bodies of Black people. They conclude that the growing rates of suicide, homicide, depression, and stress-related illnesses among Black people can be viewed as an especially virulent form of anger, self-loathing, and lost hope that leads to a devaluation of the lives of other Black people and to a devaluation of the self. I want to be very, very clear. This is not a blame the victim speech. I am from the Victor School. The lie of Black inferiority was not devised by Black people. We were not responsible for the massive global propaganda effort that used the resources of every institution to dehumanize Black people. We did not use the twin forces of religion and law to spread and enforce the lie. Black people were not responsible for the lie, but it did shape the inner lives of our great-great-grandparents, and through their children and grandchildren, our grandparents and parents, it has affected our inner lives and the inner lives of our children and grandchildren. It must stop with us. In this generation, we must take responsibility for working to extinguish the lie so that our descendants can at last be free to love themselves and each other. Religion gave the lie life, and the law gave it force. Historian Douglas Ambrose has ably described the theological gymnastics of clergy in the 18th century as they sought to prove that slavery was not only permitted, but required by Christianity. Clergy vigorously tried to persuade their brothers in the cloth, brothers who were not against slavery, who were against slavery, that it was fine to be against slavery personally, and if you didn't believe in it, you shouldn't hold slaves, but you should not advocate against slavery. You should not advocate for abolition. Black people were the subject of numerous sermons convincing them that slavery and their inferiority was part of God's plan. Yale historian John Butler has illustrated how theologians developed a complicated theology of obedience in order to explain and support the power of white masters over enslaved Black people. Leon Higginbotham, in his book Race and the American Legal Process, shows that the idea of the inferiority of Black people was stamped into law as early as the 18th century. The belief in Black inferiority, as Roger Wilkins points out in Jefferson's Pillow, was shared by the framers of the Constitution. Although some of them were a little bit more liberal than others in their attitudes towards slavery, they still held slaves and fervently believed in the inferiority of Black people. Historians David Bryan Davis and Edmund Morgan have written extensively about how fears of abolitionism in the United States caused the idea of Black inferiority to gain greater currency and spread throughout the country. The more abolitionists agitated, the more slaveholders insisted that Black people deserved to be enslaved, the more they set about treating Black people as inferiors, refusing, for example, to allow them to read or to be evangelized. There was, of course, an inherent contradiction between Christian ideals and slavery, and between the ideals of equality and liberty and the essence of slavery, the existence of slavery. According to conservative commentator Dinesh D'Souza, the lie of black inferiority helped Americans resolve that contradiction, those contradictions. As D'Souza puts it, in order to sustain slavery, the premise of black humanity had to be denied. So, over time, the lie took hold. It worked hand in glove and reinforced an already entrenched system of enslavement that gave slave owners permission to treat black people as less than human. Black men and black women did not belong to themselves. They were at the disposal of their owners. With the force of the good book and law behind them, slaveholders controlled relationships between black men and black women, determined the course of their sexual and reproductive lives without regard to their feelings, separated black men and women who had formed what relationships they could whenever it suited their business interest, and owned and seized at will the children to whom black women gave birth. Such familial relationships as there were subject at all times to the control of the slaveholder. Except as permitted by the slaveholder, black people were not entitled to form lasting relationships. Sociologist Donna Franklin, in an examination of gender relationships between enslaved men and women, shares records of freed black people's descriptions of the emotional confusion and pain and sense of powerlessness created by this system. One man reported this: "I myself had my wife on another plantation. The woman master gave me had a husband on another plantation. Everything was mixed up. My other wife had 2 children for me, but the woman master gave me had no children. We were put in the same cabin, but both of us cried, me for my old wife and she from her old husband." Our great-great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers could not, as Franklin puts it, develop the interdependency that characterized most marital relationships. Men were powerless to take care and protect their wives. Women were on their own without the protection of their men, and they had to be strong to take care of themselves and their children. And the children, well, they were ever-present witnesses, as sociologist Orlando Patterson tells us, to the daily degradation of their parents at the hands of the slaveholders. An increasing number of scholars have begun to explore what I sometimes call the emotional legacies of slavery, attitudes that were developed by our great-great-great-grandparents as ways of coping with the horrific conditions of their lives, ways of coping that were handed down like family heirlooms throughout the generations. Along with all that they handed down that was good and served us so well, came some beliefs and attitudes that have not been good for us. Attitudes about white people being smarter than black people, attitudes about black hair being bad hair and straight hair being good hair, attitudes about light skin being better than dark skin, attitudes about black people being powerless, attitudes about black women not being able to trust black men, and black men not being able to trust black women. As fatherhood activist Bernard Franklin has said, far more descends through our physical inheritance than we suspect. It is true that once black women and black men were freed, they rushed to get married. Indeed, 2-parent families were the norm in the black community from the late 1800s through 1960s. What is also undeniable, however, is that these marriages and the families that grew out of them continue to labor under the heavy burden of the lie, as well as continuing racial and economic discrimination. When apartheid was brought to a legal end in South Africa, perhaps inspired by the example of what had not happened in the United States after the end of slavery, the government of South Africa sought to find some way to assess the toll that the system of racial separation had taken on the people of South Africa. It established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate crimes committed during apartheid. Although it certainly did not please everyone, it at least recognized the importance of creating a forum for people to speak and be heard about the pain they had experienced. Some people in South Africa went even further, spurred perhaps by 20th century understandings of the impact of historical forces on people's inner lives, and by a desire to make sure that as many people as possible would have the opportunity to tell their stories. Healing of Memories workshops were run in parallel with the Truth and Reconciliation process. The goal was to facilitate interracial reconciliation and to help heal psychological wounds. In the United States, at the formal end of slavery, a time when we had little or no understanding of the emotional impact of history, Black people did not skip a beat. They married, they formed families, they got educated, they built lives. But the emotional legacies, the emotional toll of what our great-great-great-grandparents had gone through, and to varying degrees passed on to us, went uncounted. There has been no systematic effort given to the work of healing and recovery. For me, this makes all the more amazing the success of Black people. They've made extraordinary strides even as our community continued to carry the weight of the lie. So I love to think of what will happen, finally, when we are free of the lie. I love to think about that. But the alarming statistics on the state of the Black family signal that as a community, we have gone just about as far as we can go without taking decisive action to free ourselves from the lie. There is a small and growing movement in the Black community aimed at extinguishing it in order to build the healthy relationships, marriages, and families that we deserve. It is a movement focused squarely on assessing the effects of history on the emotional lives of Black people. It is a movement intent on healing. Last October, my husband and I joined with our pastor and a number of other people at St. Luke's Church, a Black church in New Haven, Connecticut, to launch a community healing network. Our mission is to promote the emotional emancipation of Black people, complete freedom, not only in body, but also in mind and in spirit. The ministry grew out of our church's call to be a place of healing and seeks to share the balm of Christ's love and healing power to help Black people overcome the emotional legacies of slavery, racism, and continuing discrimination. We want to help all Black people see themselves as God sees them, as lovable, fully lovable, smart, capable, valuable, and worthy. Much of the work of this movement is being done as it should be by Black people and institutions at the local level. But we cannot do it alone. We need the help of our fellow Americans. We need help to put the issues that are facing all families, and particularly the Black family, at the top of the national agenda. We need our nation to acknowledge the profound harm done to the Black family throughout American history, and to work to establish a new agenda for racial justice by doing its part to extinguish the lie. And on the other side of the coin, to extinguish the lie of white superiority. We need a new agenda for racial justice that focuses on families and includes bold initiatives to address persistent economic inequalities and support healthy, nurturing relationships, marriages, and families. A number of arguments have been offered in recent years to support claims for reparations for Black people. From this mother's eye view, the strongest case for reparations is not the economic case. It is the moral and spiritual case. The greatest harm done to Black people was the harm done by the lie. Its diabolical genius was what it did to undermine our abilities to love ourselves and each other. Religion in the past conspired against the Black family. I hope and pray that over the next 25 years, we will see religion and the law combine to help heal and repair the African American family. I believe that during the next 25 years, Black people will build an emotional emancipation movement to free ourselves, as Maya Angelou says, from the lies that have been told to us and the lies that we have told ourselves. Accomplishing this will mean confronting our pain and doing the hard work that it will take to heal. But we can leave our children no greater legacy, and we will do it. I know this because we are the descendants of the people who made a way out of no way.
One of the difficulties of speaking after Enola Aird, there's not that much left to say, but I'm going to do my best. You may have seen in the program that my remarks are entitled Religion, Education, and the Primacy of Family, but actually I think that they might be more aptly titled How I Learned to Stop Complaining About Being a One-Issue Voter, as I'll explain. Enola, in her remarks, set out for us both the challenges to the family in the sense of these statistics, and also a path for beginning to rebuild what needs to be built, a path that begins with rebuilding in the African American community the ability to love ourselves. And I agree with all of that. In fact, I think not only do I agree with it, but I think without following that path, it'll be impossible to rebuild. Having said that, however, I want to take the conversation in a slightly different direction. I want to talk about what have been historically the sustaining forces in the African American community and how they're dying, and what some of the threats to them are. Threats, I should add, that come from across the political spectrum. African America, since the days of slavery, has been sustained largely by two institutions, and one is family, and one is the black church. It's hard to build a community when you have only two strong institutions. It's hard enough. But when you live in a nation where each of these institutions is being systematically undermined, it's harder still. What's quite striking about the life of the African American community a little over 100 years ago, in the late 19th century, the early days of migration north, is that the marriage patterns of African Americans were similar to those of other first-generation immigrants. That is, first generation arriving on the shores. You can imagine African Americans of that day in the North and the Midwest, or what was then called the West, as first generations arriving from the South. Not only were the marriage patterns similar, but interestingly, the religion patterns were similar. People tended to found new churches which were populated heavily by people like themselves. So there were black churches, just as there were identifiably Italian churches, identifiably German churches, and so on. What's striking about those institutions is how long they have endured, even as now they suffer and the community suffers with them. It's become a commonplace of sociology today to mention that African Americans, on virtually every measure of religiosity we use, are the most highly religious group in America by most measures, and indeed in the Western world. Now that's shifting a little bit with some of the younger generation. The data there are a little bit soft, but experientially we can say, or anecdotally I should say, that church activity is falling off among the young people in the African American community a bit. But again, we don't have hard data on that yet, but that's the way it looks that things are pointing. And that's, of course, the same as you see in many other areas of life where religiosity among the young is a little lower than religiosity among their parents. Nevertheless, at every age group and in every age cohort and every income cohort, African Americans participate in religious activities at a higher rate than the median, significantly higher rate even now. It's quite striking that the black church is one of the few places that it is possible to do serious organizing in most urban communities. Whether you're doing political organizing or organizing for any other purpose, the organizing tends to run through the church because the church tends to be the institution that has survived under threat, though it may be. Another way of looking at it is this, that one of the things that we often hear about in the news media and we often experience is the problem of candidates campaigning in churches and pastors implicitly or explicitly endorsing political candidates. This often generates a great deal of outrage, especially among scholars and journalists, but in the African American community, if you don't campaign in the churches, you're not going to campaign. There's simply no place else to go and get significant numbers of people. Well, I tell you that story to tell you this one. A few years ago, I was at a conference in Miami. I was on a panel. This is about law and religion and politics. And this was back in the days when Christian Coalition was the colossus that had so many people frightened about religion and politics. After the panel, two young African-American women came up to me and told me that they were members of Christian Coalition. And we had a little conversation. And they also told me that they were Democrats and that they were politically liberal. And so I was a bit confused. But they then told me the following story. They said that they had been involved in politics for several years. They'd volunteered with a number of Democratic organizations and activist groups on the liberal side of the spectrum, and had discovered at every place they'd been that because they were self-identified evangelical Christians and quite open and joyful about that, that they were the objects of suspicion among those with whom they agreed politically. And in the end, they made the choice. They wanted to be involved in politics, and they felt they had to choose between finding someone who liked their politics and hated their faith, and finding someone who liked their faith and hated their politics. They decided to go with the people who liked their faith and hated their politics. When I tell that story, I often find people find it difficult to believe. They say that's absurd. They must have secretly been very conservative. But that's because when people have that response, it's because they simply don't believe that one's faith can be the principal driver in one's choice about how to spend one's time. The trivialization of religious faith, which is a hard and dangerous fact of public life in America today, is absolutely devastating to the African American community, where faith has been a sustainer. To find it constantly derided, treated as the dangerous outsider in the pure, unpolluted waters of politics, is actually a slap in the face, and a very hard one, to the African American tradition. Faith has been the sustainer. Even back in the days of slavery, when the slave churches that were permitted, and there were some, as Enola has mentioned, were preaching obedience, the slaves, of course, fashioned a theology of liberation, identifying closely with the story of Moses and the people of Israel, even then. You can take it right up through the civil rights movement, where again, not only was the sustainer the church, but there's a sense in which the creator of the movement was the church. It's interesting, Ed Nixon, who was one of the architects of the Montgomery bus boycott, in talking about the boycott many years later, explained how he was sitting down and trying to get leaders in the community in Montgomery involved. And he said that it was very odd, he said, because he found at the time that there were in the town 2 black lawyers, 2 black doctors, 1 black dentist, and 92 black preachers. And so it seemed to him very natural that you would go to the preachers to find the leaders. The civil rights movement, of course, threw up great leaders who were religiously motivated. The one we all know best is the Reverend Martin Luther King. And if you study Martin Luther King's public activism on behalf of civil rights, it was plainly a public ministry. I've occasionally read in some volumes by very learned scholars that the civil rights movement was really a secular movement overlaid with a kind of religious disguise. But if Martin Luther King meant his religiosity to be disguised, he hid it extremely well. In fact, his great public speeches, the one that we remember, were sermons. And many of them were based on sermons that he himself had given in the past and sermons that were part of the tradition of black preaching in particular and of Baptist preaching in general. Martin Luther King was the one who said of the argument for rights that they don't come from argument. He said to discover where they come from, it is necessary to move back behind the dim mist of eternity, for they are God-given. That wasn't a throwaway line. That was central to his public theology. Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the real heroes, was what would now, I suppose, be described as a fundamentalist. She was a fundamentalist Christian who belonged to a small fundamentalist church in Mississippi. And she had a famous encounter with Hubert Humphrey in 1964. What brought Fannie Lou Hamer to public attention was that she helped to run the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was challenging the seating of the all-white, the lily-white Mississippi delegation at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City in 1964. She led an integrated slate of delegates. Lyndon Johnson, who wanted no stain on his coronation at the convention, sent his vice president in waiting, there was no vice president at that moment, Hubert Humphrey, to go negotiate with Fannie Lou Hamer, or as Johnson put it, go talk to that woman and find out what she wants and give it to her. And so there's a famous story, which is related in many sources, that Humphrey and Fannie Lou Hamer sat in a hotel room in Atlantic City, and he said to her, Mrs. Hamer, what do you want? Because he didn't want the convention disrupted by this fight. He said, Mrs. Hamer, what do you want? And she looked at him and she said, what I want is the immediate establishment of God's kingdom here on earth. And Johnson was a powerful man, but that was not one of the options that he'd given Humphrey that he could promise. So Humphrey said, I've been a great advocate of civil rights for many years. You could have no better friend in the White House. Black people could have no better friend in the White House than me. If we don't reach a deal, I might not get to be vice president of the United States. Mrs. Hamer looked at him and she said, when I was organizing voters down in Sunflower County, I lost my job too. If you lose your job because of this, she said, God will take care of you, she said. Humphrey went back to Johnson and reported that there was nothing to be done. Johnson was a clever man, and he knew what Mrs. Hamer didn't. He knew that the church sustained the black community but did not sustain politics. So he had his people go behind her back and make deals with others who were supporting her. It was funny what happened, actually. One by one, various members of the group found themselves stuck on various important committees. Their children promised various jobs. and the floor fight became just a promise that the delegation from Mississippi could have a couple of chairs in the back of the auditorium in Atlantic City, and that was the end of that. Mrs. Hamer was undeterred, returned to her activism and to her preaching. Now, I mention that because what makes the activism of a King and a Hamer possible, what made it possible, was the ability to develop their ideas in religious community with fellow believers, largely without the interference of the outside world. I think one of the responsibilities of government is the responsibility to make the space for people to be different. James Madison in Federalist Number 10 wrote that the first object of government, he said, is to build a society in which people can be different, rather than one, he said, in which every citizen holds the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. One of the least quoted and most important Supreme Court decisions of the 20th century was the Supreme Court's decision in Pierce versus Society of Sisters in 1925, striking down an Oregon law that had the effect, although it wasn't stated this way, of all but outlawing private schools. Why was the law unconstitutional? Because the court said the liberty of parents and guardians to direct the upbringing and education of children under their control is a fundamental constitutional principle. When I think about that case and the civil rights movement, I see something about African America. That what African Americans perhaps need most is the liberty to direct the upbringing and education of children under their control, including the religious upbringing of those children. They need the space to try to raise children away from some of the pernicious influences that so damage both the family and the church. That space is vital, I think, if the community is going to be saved. Indeed, if we're going to do the hard work that Enola has laid out for us, I don't know how it can be done unless we can find that space, that island. What Roger Williams, in his metaphor of the garden in the wilderness, would have called the garden, the place where the people of faith gather together, separated by a high hedge wall. That's the wall of separation between church and state, so-called, but a high hedge wall separated from the wilderness. The purpose of the wall is not to protect the wilderness from the garden, it's to protect the garden from the wilderness. The African American family and the African American church, those are the institutions that have sustained the community, sustained its everyday life, sustained its ability to protest and be different, its ability not to be flooded over by the twin forces of racial discrimination and neglect on the one hand, and the many other difficult to assimilate, let us say, values of modern cultural life. So I think that sustaining will not be possible unless we begin to understand the responsibility of the government of the United States to see to it that there are spaces for the nurture of children, of young people who are going to be different, raised differently from the norm. Does that mean that I believe in, for example, religious schools and school vouchers? Well, sure I do. 15 years ago I was against them, then I became an agnostic, and now I'm strongly in favor of them. But it's not just that. It's not just that. I think what's going to be required is a greater respect for the role of religion in our public life and less derision of the force of religion in our private lives. We live in a world of increasing complexity, and we live at a time when a lot of people are worried. And here I speak of worried, not of the fear of terror, although people have that fear as well. People are worried about each other. We live in a world where people are sometimes scared to talk across political divisions, a world in which people on the left don't like talking to people on the right don't like talking to people on the left. We like to talk to people who are like us and think like us and tell us that we're right. We like to read only the correct blogs, the ones that tell us that the facts that are true are the ones that we need to make our worldview work. In that world of left versus right, in that world of great danger, doesn't it make sense to try to think of parents and families as not a throwaway line in politics, but the actual places to nurture difference, to nurture the next Fannie Lou Hamer, to nurture the next Martin Luther King, to nurture whoever the young people are going to be who are going to love themselves, as Enola says, and more than that, will be able to lead the way toward a different vision than the one that's imposed from the outside. I don't know how the community, the African American community, survives and thrives without being able to build that way. And I don't know how we as a society will survive and thrive if we don't see the value of a vast constellation of different views rather than only one or two. Thank you very much.
Well, it's good to be back at my old law school again, I guess, after all these many years. Emory has really changed and grown, and it's wonderful to see, although this auditorium was here when I was a student here, at least half of the rest of the building was not. So I have to snake my way through to find myself here, but it's good to be here. I don't want to get started without acknowledging just a few people. I see my dean and my constitutional law professor here, Woody Hunter. He is the man who actually taught me everything I know about constitutional law, so I want to thank you, and it's good to see you back, at least for a short time. I understand from Singapore. It's good to see you back, and thank you. And of course, I have to acknowledge my mother, who I wouldn't be here without her as well, and I have to thank her for all of her support. As well as my daughter, who's a young Spelman student who wouldn't be here without my support. Thank you. Given the widespread rate of family fragmentation in this country, it is the rare person now who has not been directly affected by divorce or knows someone who has. As one who was divorced, I am very sensitive to concerns about judging people without an understanding of how they wound up in that particular situation. Moreover, as a woman who came of age at the height of the feminist movement, I do not really hold naive notions about the so-called good old days, Ozzie and Harriet and that kind of thing. So I would never stand here for 1 minute and press for a return to an era in which stigmas about divorce prevented people from leaving abusive or oppressive marriages. Nor have I ever thought, even for 1 minute, that everyone should eventually marry. However, I believe that it is critically important that at this point in time, we base American public policy and law on the best empirical data available. And that data shows that current trends in family formation and fragmentation have potentially long-lasting and harmful effects on our children and on our communities. That's why I believe that we must explore ways how the law can preserve the protections and benefits of what has become that dirty word, marriage. The word that marriage promises hope for our children. Now, before I go further, I think I need to comment briefly on same-sex marriage, a deeply polarizing topic for large numbers of Americans, regardless of their sexual orientation. And I want to be very, very clear about this. I am not here this evening to stake out a legal position on this subject, nor would it be appropriate for me as a sitting jurist to do so. Rather, I'm here to address the more basic question of whether the law should support marriage as an institution at all. The national debate over same-sex marriage raises a host of important issues, and I think that these issues will be resolved over time. But in the meantime, we must not put off the job of reflecting on the institution of marriage as we know it now. The late Supreme Court Justice William Joseph Brennan, Jr., who I named my daughter Brennan after, once wrote, I have to say that the genius of the Constitution rests not in any static meaning it may have had in a world that is dead and gone, but in the adaptability of its great principles to cope with current problems and present needs. It is this idea that the law's strength lies in its adaptability to change that makes me want to advocate, although I'm not a judicial activist, for a body of law that is responsive to the changing needs of our time. And in my view, such a body of law cannot ignore now the wealth of evidence which now seems to demonstrate that the health of our society and our children is directly related to the health of our families. And the reality is that today alarming numbers of children are growing up in families without a mother and a father in the home, and a great many of these families are failing, and a great many of these families are African American families. Now, last year, you may recall, the New York Times published a controversial article suggesting that for the first time in history, only about half of this nation's households are now headed by married couples. Almost a third of the nation's children are born to unmarried mothers, the highest percentage ever recorded in our nation's history. For Hispanics, the figure is 46%. For African Americans, 70% of children are now born out of wedlock. Over the past 50 years, divorce has also increased dramatically before it has begun to level off a bit, declining slightly in recent years. Cohabitation has made a transition from a fringe phenomenon to an increasingly common arrangement between men and women, including many with children. Fatherhood is being pushed even further into the margins of society. Now, when I was a child in the 50s and the 60s, I'm 52 now, I memorized a nursery rhyme that went something like this. A few of you may remember it. Ginny and Timmy sitting in a tree. Kissing. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes a baby in a baby's carriage. Now, for me, that rhyme outlined a presumed order that I considered life's normal pattern. A commitment that would be difficult at times, I knew that. But I was brought up understanding that if I stuck with it, it would be one that would assure security, health, and some measure of wealth for my husband, for my children to come, for my community, and for my country. And again, I knew that the sequence was not always guaranteed. Spouses sometimes die, leaving you alone to rear your children alone. And I also knew that babies sometimes come outside of marriage. And I also knew that some marriage could not, indeed should not, last 6 months, let alone a lifetime. But never in my wildest dreams did I foresee a time when marriage, an historically child-centered relationship, would become almost completely adult-centered, promoting and protecting the freedom of adults, sometimes to the detriment of their children. But the staggering numbers indicate that we are at that point. Today, more and more children will pass through single-parent homes en route to ever more complex family structures as adults couple and uncouple in both formal and informal ways. From a child's point of view, the concept of family is becoming increasingly fluid and confusing as family relationships become less reliable. Parents, step-parents, quasi-parents are moving in and out of children's lives in unprecedented numbers. Certainly, some reconstructed families offer new, rich, viable relationships, and that's good. But they can also bring new conflicts and emotional loss. The net result of these family transformations is a dramatic increase in the proportion of children being raised by only one parent. And unfortunately, we are seeing large segments of the American population now being severely disadvantaged by this fact. Many scholars are also reporting that this marriage gap, as they're calling it, not only creates inequality among children, it's also creating inequality among whole communities. There is a marked gap in opportunity between communities in which marriage is the normal, reliable framework for raising children and communities in which it is not. In family law, there is an intensifying debate about how we should respond to these changes. Should law and society seek new ways to support marriage as the optimal institution for child rearing? Or should family law abandon that attempt altogether and instead favor more rights for its alternatives, such as cohabitation and single parenthood? Some legal scholars argue that the law should seek to reinvigorate marriage. They contend the law should remove barriers that discourage marriage, such as the marriage penalty in tax and welfare codes. They also argue for laws that would encourage marriage by, say, subsidizing marriage education programs, divorce counseling programs, and media campaigns that promote all of the benefits of raising children within a functional marriage. They tend to support measures that would discourage divorce, such as the extension of divorce waiting periods and a return to a fault-based divorce schemes. Do you know that the waiting period for a divorce in Georgia, the shortest waiting period in the country, is 30 days? At the other end of the spectrum are those who argue that the traditional marriage and family model may be the ideal, but it is an ideal that does not reflect the experience of some racial minorities, women, single parents, divorced persons, gays and lesbians, or others. They argue that families have not been weakened by divorce or unwed childbearing at all. They have merely changed in form, and that these changes have not had all the negative effects that I've outlined. Now, these pro-family diversity proponents have some powerful supporters. Some of the eminent scholars of the American Law Institute, a prestigious private association of judges and lawyers of which I am a member embraced this view in a report in 2002. The report was called The Principles of the Law of Family Dissolution. The report moves away from the idea that there can be public standards which guide marriage and parenthood. Instead, the report says, the central purpose of family law should be to protect and to promote family diversity. The report views traditional marriage as merely one of many possible and equally valid family forms. The point I'd like to highlight this evening is this. Regardless of where you fall on this spectrum, our response to this new debate on marriage has important implications for cherished American ideals concerning family, equality of opportunity, and the health and well-being of our children. What we need, therefore, is more public attention on the nature and the purpose of marriage. Marriage. And marriage must be added to the national legal discourse. Now, marriage in the United States has always been a legal institution. However, marriage is not just a legal construct, as the lawyers and everybody knows. It's also a deeply spiritual and sacred bond. It is an undeniable fact that many of our shared ideas about marriage, such as monogamy and sexual fidelity, have roots in our various spiritual heritage. Thus, marriage is a hybrid institution, an intimate, intensely private, and personal decision to enter into a public legal status that has special meaning in our broader civil society. The law can never be the creator of family. It can only be one of its many custodians. The law may declare, for example, that children have the same right to a father's care, whether they are being raised outside or inside of marriage. However, while the law may insist that a father financially support his children, it cannot mandate his love. A child support check is important, but it cannot replace a loving father or a committed, responsible, and present husband. As a result, the equality of treatment assured by the law to all children has proved elusive to millions of children who suffer daily from the economic and social inequalities often produced by the fragmented family. The social science evidence is strong that marriage is an important generation of human, social, and financial capital. Families and communities in which marriage is common have powerful advantages for children over those in which children is no longer the norm. To ignore the decline of marriage, therefore, not only puts individual children at risk, it also sets in motion a perpetual cycle of disadvantage for all of our children. How costly is this retreat from marriage? Let me give you just three quick examples from my vantage point as a justice on the Supreme Court: the courts, child well-being measures, and community health. I've been a judge now in Georgia's court system over 25 years. I started when I was 27, so I know firsthand the costs of family breakdown. In Georgia, 65% of all civil cases now heard at the trial level last year involving families and children. More than 25,000 children in Georgia were admitted to youth jails last year, and another 13,000 children are in the care of the Georgia Division of Family and Children Services. In 2005, the Georgia Office of Child Support Enforcement had a file for 1 of every 4 children under the age of 18, with the total caseload surpassing the 500,000 mark. Of these child support enforcement cases, 72% more involved were in the Superior Court. And of course, Georgia's not unique. And it's also exacted a tremendous cost on child well-being. Advocates who embrace family diversity as the goal of families laws say they're only responding to reality, the facts on the ground. But one of the facts is this: a growing body of scientific evidence now demonstrates that children suffer when families fall apart. If all family forms equally protected children, then protecting the rights of adults to form families of their children would be a noble goal. Instead, now 40 years of social science now tends to confirm that the structure that helps children the most is a family headed by their own biological or adopted children in a low-conflict marriage, as un-PC as that may sound. Children in single-family parents, children born to unwed mothers, and children in step-families or living with cohabiting couples simply don't fare as well. The spread of single-mother families has also played a major role in the persistence of poverty. In 1964, when President Johnson declared war on poverty, only 30% of poor families were headed by single mothers. Today, it's twice that amount. In the year 2000, only 8% of children living with both parents were poor, compared to 40% of children living in female-headed households. Community crime rates are also linked to family structure. In fact, Harvard sociologist Robert Sampson argues that family structure is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, predictor of variations in urban violence across the United States. His study found that nearly 90% of the change in violent crime rates between 1973 and 1995 can be accounted for by the change in percentages of unwed births, out-of-wedlock births. Of course, marriage is not the panacea for all of our social ills. Violent or abusive marriages and marriages in which alcohol and drug abuse are worse, much worse, than no marriage at all. But on average, marriage brings together the emotional, psychological, spiritual, financial, and educational resources of two parents and their respective kin networks. And just like partners in a business, partners in marriage actually produce more working together than either can produce apart. There is little or no question that our legal and social policy should continue to direct social energies toward providing protection and support for our children, regardless of what family form they're born into. Compassion for the needs of others, regardless of their marital status, is a deeply held American value. But I believe that building a viable marriage culture is also a legitimate concern of family law. And to that end, and because I'm running out of time, I just want to say that my Supreme Court last year established a Commission on Children, Marriage, and Family Law with the important goals of finding ways to reduce unnecessary divorce and unwed childbearing. We can do better. We must do better. What we do not yet know how to accomplish, we can learn. Our nation's commitment to principles of equality and our concern for all of our children require that we undertake the task of renewing marriage in this country. Thank you all very, very much for your time and attention.
I'd like to thank our very distinguished panelists for three very different, in some ways complementary, and in some ways introducing creative tension into the larger public conversation about how we move forward. Thank you all a great deal. This is an opportunity now for the audience to pose your questions, and so I'd ask that if you would quickly assemble, we have time for 4 or 5 perhaps, and ask you please begin.
Hi, David Skeel at University of Pennsylvania Law School. I have a question for Stephen Carter. It seemed to me that two of the important points you made were, first, that the church seems to be less important in the younger generation of the black community, and then second, that a really important issue going forward is creating a space for the black church. I'm curious as to whether you think those two things are connected. Why is the church less important now? Is it related to the amount of space the church has? How do those two things fit together?
You're right, that's the important question, and so I probably should have talked about it, but I can talk about it now. No, your hypothesis is correct. I think that one of the you see a fall off. They think a fall off in church attendance across the board in black churches and white churches alike. It's strongest in the mainline Protestant denominations, but you see it elsewhere as well. And yes, part of it is because there is no space of nurture in the same sense. There's a almost casual way in which we say, oh, well, that's up to the parents to do. But that's almost, that's an aside we hear a lot, but it's almost silly because traditionally parents wanting to raise their children in their faith didn't feel quite at war with the culture the way maybe they do now in many cases. And the war is worse. Like everything that happens in America, you know, white America catches a cold and black America gets the flu, that whatever maybe the cultural pressures on the nation, in the nation generally, whether one is for them or against them, they hit with much greater force in African America. And I want to emphasize, I don't think if we create these larger spaces of nurture through a variety of means that somehow everything would be fine. I don't think that. The church is one of many institutions. It's just in the African American community, it's a very important one. I just think if we don't make the space, if we don't help the church to rebuild, it's very hard to see how we're going to accomplish the rest of the very hard work that we have to do.
Thank you. We'll move in alternating fashion. Next question, please.
I have a question, I guess, which is to all three panelists. In some sense, it's a general unease that I have with a sense of a conception of the usefulness of religion, right? That we've spoken about religion in ways that it might be useful. Useful for the solving of the problem of the black family, or the dissolution of the black family. And there's a sense in which I think religionists ought to have a problem with that. That is to say that there's something that perhaps ought to be divinely unuseful. That is to say, divinely otherworldly, utterly incomprehensible in the culture in which we live, right? That is, that these slaves who found these private religious spaces could dream a world completely different than the world in which they live. So I sort of sit and listen to statistics and measures measures about sort of religion's role in solving some of these problems, and I'm uneasy in the sense of sort of this, again, the conception of religion as useful for this society, right? Useful because we want to create good citizens, useful in the creation of strong families, and I sort of want to press you on that, particularly because your conceptions of religion seem to be based in religion's ability to do something more than that, right? To sort of press a culture, to challenge a culture, to be different and to see differently. And so I just want to...
I know this is an oral argument. Well, come back. No.
Take your hand.
I don't quite get the question. Just what is the question?
I guess the question is the overwhelming sense that religion can be of use in solving these problems, and I think that there is already a tension there. That is to say that if religion is, as I think Professor Carter means it to be, countercultural, right? There is some tension with the conception that it might be of immediate use to the culture, right?
So why don't we let the panelists join you now? Thanks.
Well, since you mentioned my name, I'll say two things very, very briefly. One is I do think religion at its best is countercultural. I think the slave example is a good example. I'm persuaded by the great process theologian David Tracy that religions are at their best when they're subversive of the culture in which they exist. And I myself am a Christian. I would never defend Christianity on the ground of its utility. I would defend on the ground of its truth. And I want to make that very clear. But whatever one's faith or non-faith may be, I think it's very important to look at it that way. Nevertheless, it is also the case that a culture can be welcoming or unwelcoming toward religion, and that may help or hinder the formation of those countercultural truths. A religion has an obligation to do its best to survive and do God's work no matter what the cultural pressures are. And so if that's your point, I agree with you entirely. On the other hand, my larger point is I don't think that we as a culture should make it as hard as we sometimes do.
Because our time is winding down. Another? Yeah. I'm going to ask if all of our remaining questioners, number one, no others stand, and second, those who are standing, if you offer your pointed question, we'll proceed with brief responses. Yes.
Sure. Neil Schulman, Emory Medical School. I was wondering if there's anything we can learn from the diaspora, not just to the United States, but to other countries, and what's happening in those countries. And slavery, you know, in England, of course, stopped earlier, for instance. And are the trends in those other countries the same as the trends here with family? Is there any differences or anything we can learn?
It's sad to say. My husband and I went to Scotland to visit our daughter last year, and we're sitting in a hotel watching, hearing the House of Commons. And there before us were 3 or 4 British black people talking about the dramatic increase in juvenile crime in the Afro-British community, concerns about the music, concerns about self-perception. Jamaica, this past year, the public health authorities had to issue warnings about the dangers of skin whitening products that people are using at their peril. This is a problem that is widespread in Africa as well. We were in France, in Paris, in the Barbès section of Paris, the largely African section. The number of hair places, hair straightening places, I mean, it was stunning. This is a global issue. The lie was well told, and it was very, very effective. There is a growing awareness of the need for sort of getting rid of some of this junk that's in our heads. But it is absolutely clear to me that the African American community, as it has in the past, is in the lead on this.
Can I just add this? I've done some travel in Africa as well. We got back from South Africa about six weeks or so, and just following up on what you said, the skin lightening, I was complimented on just my natural hair. You know, and this is Africa, where kinky hair should be loved and embraced. And it's amazing to see how much further behind in self-loathing they are. It's a sad, sad thing, and something we really have to work on throughout the world, black world.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Alexis de Tocqueville said that the American nation saw itself as the most moral nation. It was a sad thing that it did the most immoral act in history from his point of view by bringing black slave culture to this society and liberating it when Anglo-Saxons have a natural distaste for intermarriage. So these are his words. This is a Frenchman speaking. In his thinking, the only way you would liberate is by a virtual amalgamation of the previous culture. Is this discussed at all in black culture? Is it distasteful even to think about amalgamation? You know, what's going on
I think
in the hood?
it is distasteful, I think. I don't you think? It happens. It's happening more frequently, but there's a pretty good segment that's concerned. I think about kind of getting washed out. From what I've seen, and my whole family's done a lot of traveling throughout. My son got back from Brazil. He went to Timbuktu on his spring break last year. Little strange little 24-year-old that likes to do odd traveling. His position is that American blacks are the least African, sort of native African blacks in the whole diaspora, and he wonders why. There's more blending in, more American, less African, and that may go into I mean, we just don't, I know so many of us try to reject it by intermarrying or what have you, I don't know.
I think clearly we're moving in that direction if you just sort of look at the numbers. From my point of view, I think that it would be good if we moved in that direction, not out of self-loathing, but because people truly fall in love with each other. My concern is that there's an awful lot of self-loathing that is directing those relationships. Can't know for sure, but.
I think there's been a threefold increase in interracial marriages since the 1970s, and hip-hop culture's affirmation of multicultural sampling certainly seems to point in that direction. Our final two questions, please.
Good evening. My name is Alicia Reeves. I'm a domestic exchange student from Rutgers University. I'm doing my current semester at Spelman College. And before I go to my question, I just want to preface and say that I hope that comment about the hood wasn't inferring that all Afro-Americans inhabit the hood, or what is considered a hood. So,
I also wondered if it was the white hood, the black hood,
right.
or Latino.
I mean, it has a negative
But please.
connotation, so I just wanted to get that out there. And firstly, thank you all for speaking, but my question is for Dr. Aird in particular. You talk about the emotional emancipation of our community as a rehabilitative, I guess, force, and it's a movement. And I'm currently reading Afro-Americans and Their Quest for Universal Freedom by Haynes Walton and Robert Smith, in which they say that for our community historically, coalition building has been very, very tenuous because most of our coalitions are with predominantly white groups that have a racist or white supremacist ideology. So I'm wondering, in order for this movement to be really impactful, what group should we coalesce with? Or should we coalesce with any groups at all? Should it just be an intra-communal movement? And will it have credence? Because historically, when we do our own movements, we don't get our voice out there.
Well, I do believe that this is an internal movement. This is something that needs to be led by black adults for black children, because I think that black young people know that there's something terribly wrong. And we as adults need to acknowledge the things that are wrong and undertake to correct them. I don't think that anyone else can, as Martin Luther King said, as long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. And he said that we need to reach down and write our own Emancipation Proclamation within our own spirit. So I do think that this is an internal issue. It can be supported and buttressed by people of goodwill of other races, but this is work that we, long overdue work, that we have to do.
Can I make just a small comment about coalition building? This also has to do, I think, with the prophetic voice of the church. As I said before, I think religion at its best is subversive, and I think churches and public activism by people of faith is at its best when it's not in the service of partisan interests, but rather a prophetic voice standing outside of politics. And if you study the ministry of Martin Luther King, what's striking about it is the ministry from the 1950s to 1964 is very different from the ministry from 64 to 67 and then 67 to 68. And what's different is that from 64 to 67, he was effectively aligned with the interests of the Democratic Party. There's nothing wrong with the Democratic Party, it's just that his preaching became more explicitly partisan, that being part of a coalition that had an electoral interest, that wanted to win elections, he was pushed in various directions to talk about certain things in certain ways and not talk about other things. When he breaks with Johnson in 67 over Vietnam, and you see the wonderfully prophetic preaching of 67 and 68, the power of that was precisely because of his realization that to do the work that had to be done, he couldn't be allied with someone else. It's not that Johnson was a racist. That's not the point of the story. It's just that political parties have electoral interests and if you get involved with that, you sometimes have to temper some kinds of remarks and emphasize other things in a way that doesn't let you preach the message with purity.
Finally.
Hi, my name is Mia Dunlap, and I'm a sophomore student at Spelman College. And my question is to Ms. Sears. I plan to, at some point, endeavor in research about young people and recidivism and who grow up in fragmented homes and how they return to jails and different things like that. So I guess my question is, what are some things that can be done to prevent continued physical and emotional impoverishment of young people who have grown up in those kind of homes, like for right now, instead of, trying to...
Well, yeah, thank you very much. That's a concern of mine and the commission as well. Forming good, many of these children came from families in which they had a mother and a father. Of course, sometimes that's difficult because there are educational problems. Some men can't find jobs and that sort of thing. But I do think, and I continue to press this, that you find about 50 to 60% of the young men in our prisons that grew up in single-parent homes, mostly single-mother homes, and I think we need to find a way to make sure that more children grow up in families that are intact, and that means a mother and a father. And when that can't happen, I think we need to have fathers not so distant from their children, that most of these young men have fathers who really were not present in their lives, emotionally or financially or spiritually. There is a lot of work on this. You'll get a lot of research on this topic, so you'll have no problem finding all of the answers that you're looking for. Did I answer your question? If you want to follow up.
Yeah, maybe offline
maybe,
afterwards
yeah,
you all can
offline.
follow up. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, thank you again to
Okay,
our
all
distinguished panelists.
Thank you very much, President Franklin, Professor Aird, Professor Carter, Justice Sears. You have given us a gift tonight as we have thought about what it is we all need to be about in the coming decades. And that is what we hoped you would do, is help chart out for all of us the issues that we need to be addressing as we move forward in the Law and Religion program. Thank you all for being here tonight. I hope you will join us again tomorrow morning as our discussions continue. Travel home safely tonight. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.